Guess what, theology nerds? You're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, the #1 audiological resource for your theological goodness. And it's right here on the internet. For over 11 years, I've been bringing you all the zestiness your earpiece can handle. And that is going to happen again today, my friends. Why? Because Dr. Robert Russell's on the podcast. He is a physicist and theologian. He is the Ian Barbour Professor of Theology and Science at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He's the founding director of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. And as you'll hear, he's a lot of fun to talk to. I'm not joking. I mean, in this conversation, we talk about physics. We talk about the many worlds interpretation and fine-tuning and all that kind of stuff. We talk about non-interventionist objective divine action. If that doesn't make you excited on the inside, I question your nerd card, you know? And we talk about a bunch of other things all the way to, cosmology, divine action, eschatology, aliens. And did Jesus witness to Chewbacca? Or was there a Wookie Christ figure? Good question. I asked him. Anyway, before we jump into this episode, which I'm anticipating sheer joy to come across your inner nerd when you listen, I want to remind everyone this coming weekend on the September 21st, I will be in the lovely state of Indianapolis. That's right. I will be in Indianapolis. Going to have a lot of fun there. Then the next weekend, the end of September, my last big event in the United States before moving all the way across the pond to Scotland, is in Cary, North Carolina, which is Raleigh-Durham. It's called to be Prophets. And two of my best friends are going to be there. Who's that? Robin Henderson Espinoza and, that's right, Brian McLaren. Boom shakalaka. So you should definitely come to one of those two if you're within the area. You know what I mean? Also, I wanted to tell you that we are launching today a brand new giveaway at Homebrewed Christianity. That's right. If you go to the website, homebrewedchristianity.com or trippfuller.com, or you go to any of our social media pages like on Facebook or the Twitter, I'm sure you will find the brand new giveaway. And what are we giving away? $1,200 worth of books on Paul, and specifically the book of Romans. Why? This wrestled with text for the history of the church. I mean, there's so many different questions, and all these things come down to these fights about Romans and what do we do with it. And well, the thing is, in the last 100 years, Pauline studies has had a giant revolution. There are tons of new roads through the book of Romans that, your Sunday school teacher didn't anticipate. And we're going to be talking about them in the near future on the podcast. But as part of that whole thing, getting it off, wetting the whistle, is this giant giveaway. And who doesn't want to win $1,200 worth of books? Boom shakalaka. That's what I'm saying. So go check that out. All right. Now, last thing is this week is the first, we have a big lecture doing for the Intro to Systematic Theology class. If you're a member, you should be getting an email with a link to join live. You'll get it sent in video and audio afterwards. You don't have to be there live to do that. It will even show up in the Elder of Homebrewed Christianity podcast feed. If you want to join that class, if you want to become a Homebrewed Christianity deacon, right, and get the special podcast feed just for the deacons that has a lecture from Walter Brueggemann's Intro to the Bible class coming up, then just go to homebrewedcommunity.com. You can support the podcast, become a part of the infamous, legendary even, 0.25% of you listeners who are a part of the community. They're elect. They're guaranteed salvation. All right. Okay, I'm kind of optimistic eschatologically anyway. But if I wasn't, I would definitely think the limited atonement, if I believed in limited atonement, I don't, included Homebrewed community members. All right? Now, get ready for some theology and science with Robert Russell. Boom shakalaka. All right. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and Robert Russell is on the podcast. He is the Ian Barbour Professor of Theology and Science, the director at the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences in wonderful Berkeley, California. And now he's right here on the podcast. Before we jump in, I'll just tell everyone, when you get pumped about this book or about his work, you want to go get his book on cosmology. It's exciting. It's in one of my favorite Theology and Science series. And when you go to Amazon, there's multiple Robert Russells. Have you noticed that before?
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's another guy who's not like you at all who writes around religion and science. So the J and the initial is important.
Yes.
But a couple weeks ago, I forgot to mention that. And then someone texted me and goes, I really like the podcast, but I looked at this book and it's just not good. And I was like, no. The middle initial is important.
Thanks, Tripp. Yeah, it's actually Cosmology from Alpha to Omega, Fortress Press. So it's on sale now.
Awesome.
Your clearance sale.
Well, so one of the things that people find out about you is that you come to theology after being a scientist. So maybe you can tell us a bit about your own autobiography and how religion and science became not just parts of who you are, but vocationally important.
Thanks. Well, first, thanks so much for inviting me to be on the show. I've listened to you many times, and it's great. Big fan of yours, and particularly like the interview with Phil Clayton, who's a great friend of mine, and your Dr. Fodder. So good. I have kind of interesting, unusual, odd biography. I really thought of myself as a budding scientist as a kid. I loved astronomy. I had a little telescope and spotted Saturn the first night out, and had to convince my dad that was really Saturn because I was 8 years old and he didn't think I could have found Saturn on my own. Made a telescope at Griffith Observatory and just had a great time. Went to Stanford with a triple major, physics, religion, and music. And, I just discovered that while I really think of myself as a scientist and I have that bent of mind in many different meanings, the clash between the sort of worldview that science gives, I don't mean scientism, but just, the knowledge of the world. And my own faith tradition as a Protestant Christian, an ecumenical Christian, just seemed to get worse and worse. I did a triple major, read Bonhoeffer and Tillich and all that stuff. But though I wanted to be a scientist by training, I went to seminary, Pacific School of Religion at the GTU, that's the Graduate Theological Union where I am now, and did a couple of years there, did an MDiv, MA, and then the decision was what to do for a PhD. And I got mixed advice. Sorry, but the one I went with was get a PhD in physics. First, it's just so much harder to learn science as a theologian than vice versa. And it would give me more access, frankly, more openness, more doors would open in the community of scientists to someone thinking about theology. Did a PhD in physics, 2 years theoretical general relativity, published some papers. 4 years on experimental physics. During that time, figured I'd go back to the GTU and begin what I came to call the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. They really wanted a community of scholars to have a wide variety of viewpoints so I could fit in amongst them, but not be in any way a kind of domineering voice. But I saw an ad in Physics Today for a 1 year leave replacement at Carleton College, and that's where Ian Barbour is teaching. And of course, he's one of the pioneers of the recent field of theology and science. And I got the job, amazingly, and stayed there 3 years. Loved it. Could have gone on as a tenured professor, but this urge or this drive to relate theology and science was just too much. When I was 12, my dad died suddenly, and we had our minister, Episcopal minister, over for dinner. I was very close to him, been an acolyte, served communion a zillion times with him, and felt really close to the church. I took him out to my workshop, and I was making a little transceiver, an ICO transceiver, and a Bunsen burner was going. It was really quiet. And I said, ever see this? Well, I see my dad in heaven. And he said, I'm 12 now. He said to me, Bob, he put his hand on my shoulder, because of science, we don't believe in heaven anymore. So that always stayed with me. It just drove me to the question of, well, do I believe in the resurrection? And of course I do as a matter of faith, but does it make any sense? How would I relate it intelligibly to the world that I know of through science? And again, I don't mean a scientific view that reduces metaphysics to science. I just mean the world of, 10 to 11 stars in our galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
So that really drove me to leave Carleton and come back to California with the support of my wife, Charlotte, and begin CTNS. That was 1981.
So one of the things that I find varies across the church, and it differs whether what part of the church you're in or what part of the country you're in, is how conscious people are of the potential tensions and conflicts between science and kind of the basic tenets of a monotheistic religion, and in all the way to something particular like the resurrection. But there's a type of illiteracy about science in the church, or standoffishness in certain quarters. And I wonder, what are the questions that if we don't engage in this conversation, we're abdicating a responsibility to think through our faith and wrestle with truth today?
Great. Thank you. Well, I mean, one obvious thing is ethics. So many profound issues in our society are driven by bioethics, stem cell research or human genetics, so on, mental illness. And how can you have a voice in that, a credible voice, if you don't understand evolution? Mm-hmm. How we came about to have these genes and what that's about. So you really can't, a person has a hard time just doing the ethics that technology raises today without knowing some science. But for me, it was always more a worldview. It was a credibility. How do I make sense of a universe which, according to the best of our sciences, relativity will expand forever. In fact, it's accelerating. So it'll get colder and colder, and in a large but finite amount of time in the future, there won't be anything but plasma. Mm-hmm. With the view that beginning at Easter, God has begun a process of transforming the creation to the new creation. And there are elements of continuity and discontinuity because it's based on the notion of resurrection as elements of continuity and discontinuity between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. Mm-hmm. And how I've just been driven by that. When I went to seminary, honestly, every afternoon to go in the library and just go up in the stacks and pull books off the shelf and go to the table of contents and look to see what they said about resurrection and just work through it. New Testament books, historical texts, contemporary theology, and found that when it was discussed, it was almost never discussed in light of science, which, I mean, you and I know why. I mean, because of the rise of biblical criticism and all the story of 18th and 19th century, but still, what do you do about it? I mean, I can tell you why it happened, but what to do about it is the issue. So I think, a lot of people who are devout scientists, who are Christians, don't go that far into the story. They see science as either neutral to faith, so they follow Stephen Jay Gould, which is fine, a very practical way of doing life. You can't always be doing everything and go crazy. Or they are concerned, rightly so, that science is being co-opted by atheists. And usually the atheists, like Dawkins and so on, don't really know much of philosophy or theology. They're really dismissive, obviously.
Yeah.
What they're saying. But still, how do you argue with them, and how do you keep your science from being co-opted? So I think there's a kind of basic level of engagement that just says science shouldn't be used in support of atheism, and I need to engage science because, if nothing else, I've got to be able to talk about the ethical issues technology based on science raises. But I personally, as a person of faith, Muslim, Jew, or Christian, want to be able to relate somehow these very different eschatological views of the future of the universe and its purpose. Yeah. And if it's all just soul saving, which of course it isn't, that's Gnostic. But if that's all it is, the body doesn't matter, then how does the earth matter? How does climate change matter? How does the galaxy matter? So to me, the empty tomb says matter matters. Matter has a future that is important for God. That's why God created matter and became incarnate in matter.
Mm-hmm. So when you are thinking about the relationship between scientific cosmology and your work as a Christian theologian, what are the places in contemporary cosmology where there's kind of some shared consensus And what are the elements in cosmology where one's kind of ideological center are more likely to show?
Right. Well, I'm much indebted to the Vatican Observatory CTNS series, and we talk about this a lot. And I found a lot of wonderful ideas from John Pelton-Horn, who we've shared, and Ian Barbour, others. One of the things a lot of folks point out is that there are some underlying elements of science which are sort of manifestations of the new creation already. I mean, I think the Pythagorean theorem is true, and it's going to be here in the new creation. I think the notion of symmetry in mathematical physics, the beauty of symmetry, the beauty of field theory. I mean, I'm speaking as a physicist, that's where my training is. The beauty of Einstein's equations, I mean, the fact that you can describe the entire universe with 3 symbols, and it's delta delta equals 0, so 4 symbols. It's astonishing. It's almost sacred. So there are things that science deploys and constructs which I think are of transcendent value. And, and that's why Paul Davies would call his first book The Mind of God, that you and I do, hard work in science, experimental and theoretical, to get to the underlying laws of nature, because those are somehow created by and embedded in God's mind. So you're reading God's mind. That's Platonic, but still there's a certain truth to that. So I think you could say there are definitely things about the world which are already true and will always be true, this creation or its transformation, like the ones I'm mentioning. And there are many others. In a social setting, of course, it's agape love, right? Agape love is already a taste of the new creation in our midst. We're living in it. On the other hand, obviously, there are things that are really tragic about nature, right? And natural disasters like the tsunamis or disease, through the suffering of animals. Most animals die a miserable death of pain in the jaws of the animal. I mean, there's just things that, you want to say, this isn't the way it should be. And of course, the ancient Genesis text says, no, it isn't the way it originally was. Now, you and I can't appeal to a historical fall in that direct a way, but I have what I call the fall without the fall. I would say that what we have now in the current state of brokenness, both in human relations, which we call sin or moral evil, and in nature, which you can call natural evil, is a slow arising of more and more beauty and brokenness. So you get the arising of through evolution of complexity and sentience. You also get the arising of the capacity to do violence. So there's no point before which everything was good. The goodness, to quote Pannenberg and Peters, the goodness is eschatological. The nature fully good is its future, not its past.
Well, and I think that's important. Just I've taught enough philosophical theology classes in different settings to realize, for some people, the like having a literal Adam and Eve or having an actual fall and things are hills to die on theologically.
Right.
And what you're just describing there, and I think it'd be helpful to unpack, is that when you start thinking things through scientifically, there are actual ways of both articulating the doctrine in a new robustness with the tools and insights we gain about the cosmos, about what it means to be human, our biological inheritance, and that type of stuff that gives a different type of tactility to the doctrine without deflating it. Because I think the fear sometimes is the moment you let science in, or the moment you start to talk to other religions or something like that, we're going to just deflate Christian theology down to nothing. And what a lot of the work you do, and Ted did it when he was on the podcast, is to kind of demonstrate that an engagement across disciplines and across religious traditions doesn't keep you from articulating robust Christian accounts.
Exactly. Well, two things that are kind of stand out. One is truth can't challenge truth. So whatever science discovers that's true, and it's always provisional, it's got to be coherent with whatever we discover theologically about biblical truth, which is also provisional in some way. Second thing is, I'm old enough to have been around in the Vietnam War, and there was so much fear of the kind of domino effect. You lose one nation, you get all South Asia's gone. That I'm very wary of that kind of, don't let science in because you'll lose everything. This whole idea is, of course, is unpack the biblical tradition and say, well, what's central and essential to being a Christian? What's cultural and a kind of a way of expressing it? So, for example, it's essential to say that God, Yahweh, created the universe ex nihilo. Mm-hmm. But you can use the Genesis account to structure according to the Babylonian cosmology. But I'm not affirming Babylonian science when I use the Genesis 1 chapter 1 account. So you need to do some work to be able to unpack it. But the glory of the Genesis 1 account is that the Hebrews, upon returning from exile, were able to use the best of science, which was their Babylonian cosmology, to proclaim their enduring faith in Yahweh, who was then becomes the creator of that cosmology. Mm-hmm. Well, if they can do that, we're required to do that, to continue that conversation, because it's always a mixture of the cultural expression of the biblical truth and the truth itself that gets impact in that culture. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm doing in Theology and Science.
Mm-hmm. And if you just think from the inheritance in Scripture of that conversation in ancient Mesopotamia, you also have Christians who developed their cosmology, doctrine of creation, in dialogue with Aristotle, and then those that did it with Newton, and then Einstein and stuff today. When you look at that history, what do you learn from the task of constructive theology when there is this ongoing engagement with our religious text, with the receiving of that text, but also with our understanding of the natural world?
Right. Well, take Aristotle as a great example. Here, St. Thomas Aquinas is able to not be afraid of Aristotle as his contemporaries were in Paris, but to embrace it and say, look, I can use this as a metaphysical scaffolding because it's, an incredibly profound view of nature and of history. And I can use it to proclaim the gospel. And he does it in his many works. And I have very close neo-Thomistic colleagues at the GTU who continue to do that work. And it's just a great example of using a metaphysical system to bridge science and theology. Now, people like Barth and Pannenberg are very different. Barth, of course, is clearly based in the self-revelation of God and doesn't use cultural structures, or not too much, a little bit of Kant. But someone like Pannenberg, who's one of my heroes, and as is yours and Phil's, says theology can't be kept within the confines of the church and be theistic. That's just a criticism of Barth in a nutshell. But in fact, science is an essential role to the theological project of systematics, that is unfolding the text, and he does it through the history traditions. And so science comes to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things I've really appreciate in what Pannenberg done, and those who continue to do it, is for a lot of Christians, their experience of theology is some set of conclusions they picked up from the tradition they're born into, or their minister, or in confirmation, or something like that. And Pannenberg kind of insists that if what we're talking about when we talk about God as Christians is as big as we've proclaimed in history, then the questions that arise are things we don't settle up front and then figure out how to repeat the words before. We carry the questions into our life as disciples, as the Christian community, as scholars, and so there's a certain piety around cultivating the best questions and engaging in the most thoughtful critiques. That's just part of faith. So that I think a lot of the anti-intellectualism in American Christianity is kind of allergic to. That having good questions, doubting things, and wrestling with it and stuff isn't evidence against faith. It's actually necessary for a faith that takes the questions seriously.
Exactly. I mean, Paul Tillich in his little work on faith is so clear that faith and doubt go together, because faith means me as finite being grasped by the infinite. So the fact that I'm grasped is the basis of my faith and experience of the infinite. But because I'm finite, it's always going to be partial and abstract and broken and always in need of revision. So that's what we call doubt. So it isn't as if doubt is opposed to faith. Doubt is the process by which we live in and increase our faith. Pannenberg is a great example of what you and I are talking about, though, in his Jesus, God, Man in the 60s, where he really is able to argue for the historicity of the resurrection using historical methods. Mm-hmm. And it's subtle, because he has to say, well, you can't use the reductive argument of historians that God couldn't exist per se, or people don't get resurrected because I've never seen it. He argues against that Humean induction and says that's metaphysical naturalism coming in. But if you put that aside, you can give a really good historical account for the reality of the resurrection. And part of it's what N.T. Wright does now by saying you can't really account for the incredible explosion of the Christian church without there having been something like a resurrection and an empty tomb. So those are examples of the engagement of deeply Christian scholars with contemporary secular disciplines.
In part of it is learning to be careful about methodology. And so maybe you could draw a distinction between methodological naturalism and when those methodological assumptions become kind of imperialistic ideology of closure for the presence and reality and action of God.
Right. Well, methodological naturalism is a general term, but I tend to mean by something pretty simple. That it's an attempt to see how far can we get understanding nature or history if we say, try to explain natural events by natural causes, to see how far you can get. So if you and I were in the car and the car broke down, we wouldn't say, well, let's pray about it. We take it to the car shop. And we get some mechanic who knows about cars to try to figure out what natural causes cause it to break down. To say, well, the only causes of nature are the ones you can use in physics or biology is, of course, metaphysical naturalism. It's the leap from physics to metaphysics. And Barbour was famous for saying, there's no direct path. There's no forced induction from physics to metaphysics. It gives you a hint, right? But it doesn't tell you what the world's really like. And so I think it's very important, as you said, once you distinguish between methodological and metaphysical naturalism, then the door is open to a dialogue with science. Whereas if you believe people like Phil Johnson and a lot of the ID folks that say methodological naturalism forces you into metaphysical naturalism, then of course you've got a choice. Because if you engage science, you are going to be seen as engaging with atheism. And that's the kind of move they want to make. I think it's an unfair move because it isn't necessarily true. We all know that. Yeah. And it handicaps the Christian who hasn't had the training to know the difference. So my point is, science is fine, scientism isn't.
Yeah, and I think that's the positive side of that observation. You talk about how the role of theology in the emergence of science, the way in which the assumptions at the bedrock of a type of monotheism are a part of our reception and engagement of the world that leads to the emergence of science.
Right. I mean, it's pretty clear from the work of historians of science that natural science emerged in the Western culture because of two roots: one Greece, one Israel. If you believe that God created the world as a free act of love, then the world's contingent. It needn't be the way it is. Mm-hmm. So the only way you can find out what God created is to go and look, right? So the empirical method is warranted by ex nihilo faith. And the second thing is the Greek view that you can find out something about the world by experiment because the world's intelligible. And the world's intelligible because it has a source in the divine logos, the kind of structure of reason itself. And for Christians, we took that notion and embedded into a doctrine of Trinity. And that's the second person through whom God creates the world. Mm-hmm. So it's a natural move to say, in a climate of ex nihilo and in a climate of empirical knowledge, that empirical knowledge really counts, that together will give you the foundation for natural science. So even if a scientist like Richard Dawkins is a committed atheist, the truth is the science he's using, which he sort of, the theories of which he claims to support atheism, actually come out of a theistic view of the world, a kind of soft theism. It doesn't say God exists. But I mean, just a quick example, I had 7 wonderful summers, a week each summer, with colleagues in Kyoto at Ryokoku University, where you have the foundation of Pure Land Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And after we got to know each other pretty well, Russellis would say to me, Bob, it's great to have you here as a Christian to talk about theology and science, but guess what? If we Buddhists engage with science, we're already engaging implicitly with the Christian worldview. It so clearly, comes out of this kind of Christian approach to nature that we feel very comfortable with just talking about science as Buddhists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you one of the questions that a couple people had mentioned in the Homebrew group on Facebook was asking to get a guest to lay out what people mean by the anthropic principle. Sure. And there are some questions around like the fundamental constants and that type of thing. So when you're a physicist and you look at the whole cosmic story, what about what preceding the emergence of life makes sense in the narrative?
Right. Well, go back to when I was a kid at the university, way back before reptiles were on the world and stuff. It was a long time ago. But in those days, it just seemed a given that physics is physics. And then if you happen to get the right planet with some, right conditions, and you'll get life. It's kind of irrelevant. It doesn't tell you about the universe. It's a kind of byproduct. There's no relation to. And in physics language, you say, well, we have to memorize the speed of light, what it actually is. But it could be 1 meter per second faster or slower. We wouldn't know the difference. You wouldn't care. It's an arbitrary constant. So in that world in the 60s, there was a complete divorce between physics and biology, let alone neuroscience and psychology and the arts and everything else. It just didn't seem that biology could tell you anything about the way the world is, except it's a kind of consequence, a random consequence. In the mid-'80s, people began to notice this amazing fact that the universe that we're in from T equals 0 to now, the universe as such, is characterized by certain fundamental constants. We always knew them, like the speed of light, Planck's constant, and so on. These are numbers that appear in the equations of physics, but we don't really have any clear idea of where they come from. I mean, I don't want to go into technical language. Basically, they seemed arbitrary, but then as you begin to look at them more closely, it turns out that small variations in them would not have allowed for life to evolve. The universe would expand too fast to produce stars. You wouldn't have converted hydrogen to helium. There's books full of these arguments.
Yeah.
So these are all called fine-tuning arguments. And again, if you have 5, let's say, fundamental constants, and a variation of 1 part per million of each one would give you a universe that's incompatible with life, then you have a 5-dimensional hypercube with on 1 millionth on each edge, and the universe has to be in that to be a universe which is friendly to life. And we're in that one, obviously, because you and I are here. So then the question becomes, well, why is that? How do you explain that? And of course, the divide between the two sides as well. The simplest explanation is God created the universe in the right way. God had created the universe, after all, to produce life and sentience and creatures capable of receiving grace and coming into communion and agape love. So clever God creates a universe that's biophilic and produces life. Immediately, the response was, well, no, that's nonsense. First of all, it shuts down science because you can't ask the question because you give a theological reason for it. But second, because you could simply say all possible universes exist. And the value of the constants in our universe is insignificant because there are universes with every other value. Mm-hmm. So, of course, we're in the universe we're in. Right? Rosanna Dan on Latin. Is this the party to whom I'm speaking? We're talking about the world we're in, period. And the debate goes back and forth now. It's easy to make the case that that latter one isn't just scientific, but it's actually metaphysical. Because you have to stipulate the actual existence of an uncountable infinity of universes, each distinguished by a slightly different value of the constants, in order to account for our universe's existence. But all you really have are mathematical equations that give you the range of those values. And it's obvious that there's no principle in physics that says possible solutions to mathematical equations have to be realized in nature. Right? That's a metaphysical claim.
Yeah.
So it turns out that the choice between God and many worlds isn't really a choice between theology and science. It's really a choice between one metaphysics, that is theistic metaphysics, and another metaphysics, that is a kind of atheistic metaphysics. Mm-hmm. So suddenly it's not a theology and science debate. It's really a debate between two metaphysics.
Yeah. And that's why I mean I think it's important to point that out, because when I was a minister in LA, there were a lot of people who were practicing scientists in their fields or had someone in their family it was, and the assumption I think was like we're at a church, but we're more kind of deisty with Jesus ethics connected to it of some sort, because science. And then, not that they understood it, right? Like they wouldn't be taking science, thinking through it philosophically and stuff. Like when a lot of them that were practicing scientists would say things like, "Look, I just do the math, or I just do the study, and I specialize in making a certain type of plastic." But
Right.
the assumption is, because of the culture around the sciences, that the data, their interpretation of it, and the philosophical assumptions that aren't necessary by the data are all one cloth. Right. And so something like the many worlds is just an example of how your metaphysical commitments can be wedged in, and then they get the same type of authority that Benadryl, when you have a allergy attack, gets.
Yeah, we used to say, even if you're not a smoker, if you live in LA, secondhand smoke from smog is pretty bad. And it's like that, even if you're not explicitly an atheist. The kind of prevalent community as well. I don't see any evidence of God. And I see a lot of bad things in the world, so theology is wrong.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I really appreciate about you, and you talk about this in the cosmology book, but have been working on it for a long time, is non-intervention objective divine action. I have a couple weeks ago, I don't know if it's come out yet, I was recording. Oh yeah, it did. It came out 2 weeks ago. I was on Robert Wright's podcast, the Wright Show, and he said, "Look, are there Christian theologians that believe in causal closure, and like what exactly? How little do you have to believe to still use the word God?" And I was like, "Well, if you come to the academy meetings, I don't think anyone can. Like, mm-hmm. But if you're asking me what I think, like, I think if you're a minister, at least, like if I stopped believing there's a real God that did real things, and one of those things was involved in Jesus in a particular way, I would probably switch teams."
Yeah.
And so maybe before getting into your own kind of thesis, try to lay out what's up for grabs and what are the challenges when we start to ask questions around divine action, and eventually asking questions around the eschaton, the resurrection, and such.
Right. Thank you. Well, I mean, up till the Enlightenment, miracles were taken for granted, and there were different views of them. Augustine had a view that almost everything is a miracle. An omni-miraculous view of nature, which is gorgeous. Aquinas had a very interesting view of miracles. There were three kinds. There were kinds that God's action through nature reveals profound possibilities for nature we don't usually see, kind of extraordinary versus ordinary action. But Aquinas also said that God can act in nature in ways that nature could have done without violating nature. He didn't say violate, but he said without becoming a secondary cause. When Hume came on board, 18th century, the conversation got kind of diminished because Hume defined, of course, miracle in terms of God violating a law of nature. And since God created nature and laws, then why would God violate them? Mm-hmm. And that was one of his arguments to say, well, God doesn't act in special events. Now, as you know, that view versus the wider spectrum of views became the kind of dominant, basic default view of miracle. And it really has divided the church between, conservative and liberal, taking a lot of this from Nancy Murphy's work. And conservatives will say, well, I think miracles are essential to Christian faith. And if they challenge science, so much the worse for science. And so you're in a conflict model. Mm-hmm. Liberals from Schleiermacher, early 19th century forward, will say, and he said, miracle is a religious term for an ordinary event. So I go to see an eclipse. I've been to see eclipses. And one of the eclipses is absolutely gorgeous and spectacular and miraculous. And, the sky is fantastic. The sun is gorgeous, but it's not a miracle. in a literal sense. In fact, it's precisely because of the precise deterministic laws of astronomy that you get this event. So conservatives see it as a violation. The liberals will say it's really a natural event, that you just take it to be special. The birth of your child is miraculous. And that divide has been with us till today. Now, I want to pause for a second and say, here's a divide in and between Christians, which is not due to some theological argument. It's not due to how many sacraments are there or how do you read the Gospel of John. Mm-hmm. It's an external problem. It's a problem generated by a philosophical view of the world based on science, mainly Newton. And the way I tell my seminary students, it'd be as if we're all out there playing basketball, having a great time. And then a voice booms, stop playing basketball and play rugby. And we all do that. But it's not one of us saying it. It's some voice external to the school that says it. So why do we allow this voice of determinism based on science to set the agenda for a theology of divine action? Mm-hmm. Now, with a non-interventionist divine action, I make the case that, well, if the world is not like a machine, but is more like, John Plummer, in his delightful way, would say more like clouds and clocks. If it's more open and flexible, just as we believe we are, free will, then it's possible for God to act in, with, and through nature to bring about things that nature wouldn't have achieved by herself, but in no way by interrupting or intervening or overcoming or stopping the process of nature, because they're, in fact, open and flexible. Mm-hmm. So that gives you a non-miraculous view, but of God making counterfactual events occur. You get the both of both sides. You get the best of the conservative side, which is God really answers prayer. And you get the best of the liberal side, which is God does so in and through nature, not against nature. So it's not intervention, subjective divine action. So it's a third category of divine action. I still believe in miracles, unlike some of my colleagues in theology and science. I really do. But this is another option that you don't have in a deterministic world.
And I think the most difficult part for people around questions of miracles, like sometimes we talk so bad about it because of the problem of evil and because of personal experiences. And when we talk about miracles, it's because we really want one, be it, a parking spot all the way to dealing with a tragedy. But the number of Humeans in the congregation is significant, right? Like David Hume, the philosopher, has, and I've been trying to come up with, like, what are the ideas of Hume and company that are most detrimental? And from what you're saying, the three that pop up are the kind of mechanistic, deterministic picture you get in a Humean account, where everything's kind of set, ordered, and running. That your access to the world is only through your senses, and Hume intensifies that for everybody. But the other one is that the world is naturally distanced from God, right? Mm-hmm. Like that for God to do anything, God has to break laws and show up. Mm-hmm. And when you read Scripture, God is a living and life-giving God, and present and active. And oddly enough, if you don't ask about miracles, but you just ask congregants from the most progressive church I worked at in California to conservative friends in North Carolina, if you ask them about their encounter and experience with God, they describe a dynamic spiritual relationship, not a distant out there deity that occasionally shows up. Right? And so sometimes these theological questions, when they aren't dealt with and they aren't part of our formation as people of faith, then we run around with a Humean framework and then are stuck interpreting science, and God's far off and would have to break the integrity of creation to be present and act. And that's just a very sad picture to me that Christians have that.
Well, you're right. And that's a problem with Hume, but it's actually another problem. We're Trinitarian Christians. Mm-hmm. And Trinity is both economic and immanent. That is, Trinity is actually the Trinity that works in history, revealed in history. And that Trinity refers to God as Trinity, which is the source of the world. So we already have a God that's acting in history and nature, period. Second point to reinforce that, people like Arthur Peacock would talk about transcendence and immanence, that God, as transcendent creator, is so different in nature from us, from the world, that God could be more present to us than we are to ourselves, drawing on Augustinian insight. So intervention isn't just about whether God has to get into the world to act. It's really about the kind of action God takes. Because even for Arthur, who had a fully immanent God, he was a compatibilist. God never did things against nature or beyond nature or things that nature alone couldn't do, because that would be a kind of intervention. So he used intervention in a much more restrictive way. That is, not that God wasn't present, but that the present God wouldn't act in the ways I'm talking about. So he would call me an interventionist, not because he didn't think I didn't have an immanent God, because he thought I had a God who acted in ways that goes beyond nature. And I said, yes, I do, but that isn't intervention. The intervention issue is Hume. Let's go back to your point. Hume had 3 or 4 pieces to his argument. One, that the physics he had was it. We knew the laws of nature, they weren't going to change. Now we know we have new ones like quantum mechanics. So that's the first big step. Hume based his notion of miracle on a mechanistic physics.
Yeah.
And second, he thought that causality was always bottom up. There was no top-down causality. So if physics is deterministic, the world's deterministic. And that then easily gives you a metaphysics of determinism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so we've seen 2 changes, and there are others, but that's enough for now. One is new physics, quantum mechanics, relativity, cosmology, all the stuff we talk about. Complexity theory, that's one John Polkman likes. The second change is we know that there's top-down causality. I mean, I'm waving my hand, whether your audience can see it or not. I'm waving my hand. My hand isn't waving itself. I'm fully convinced that there's mind-brain causality. You need a brain to have a mind, but mind can act on the brain. And working out the details is, of course, immensely complicated. But Nancy Murphy's done some great work on that. But nevertheless, the point is, Hume didn't have that. So his notion of miracle is based on a highly truncated view of nature and God. So even, just to summarize, even with Arthur Peacock, say, you emphasize immanence, you still have to go back to Hume and challenge his notion that physics is uniquely deterministic and causality is bottom-up only. Once you got those pillars knocked over, then Hume creates no problem for us.
Right.
But you have to do that work to get there. Otherwise, like you said, your congregation, knowing it or not, is secondary smoke. They're in an atmosphere that's Humean, and they're breathing and living in it and thinking in it without thinking about it explicitly.
Yeah, and one of the things that contemporary science, when you talk about kind of quantum mechanics, relativity, and such, is that, in fact, a more robust awareness of contemporary science can actually break through some of the 19th century assumptions that exist in the minds of contemporary religious practitioners who kind of assume the scientific story is a closed and determined one.
Yes, exactly.
No, David Wilkinson, when I interviewed him, one of the ways he put it that I thought was really helpful is he said that sometimes people's philosophical commitments, even unexamined ones, insist that for God, for a living God who's present to act, it must inhere in the descriptive account of the world that science gives. And what those who are arguing for a non-interventionist, objective type of divine action are looking for, recognize that God has a freedom so that it must cohere with the integrity of creation. But it doesn't have to inhere in it, in that it is completely settled and determined, and you can work out the outcomes, right? If you have like the fundamental laws and then a starting position.
Right. Yeah. No, David's right, of course. Another way of saying it, I think he would agree, is that in the theology and science conversation, you try to embed or take up science into theology. So theology already has a detailed notion of divine action, and then you see how science influences that notion. But you don't try to reduce the theological notion to science and somehow, even though God's immanent, you don't reduce divine action, the epistemology of divine action, to the epistemology of physics. Mm-hmm. That would be scientism.
How would you describe the when you introduce the way God is present and active at the quantum level and what that enables at higher levels of complexity? How do you kind of frame that for people that it would be new idea to?
Right. Well, the simplest way is to say, look, quantum mechanics is an agreed upon theory for 100 years, but it's open to many interpretations. And that's got to be said at the outset, because when I say Newton gave us a deterministic world, that's an interpretation of Newton. But it's really the only valid one you can make. It's kind of hard to see Newton supporting an open world. But quantum mechanics really does have different interpretations. And there is a deterministic one that was David Bohm's. David Bohm gave a very profound deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics. It just was global, not local, so long story short. I'm following a different interpretation. I'm following the one that Bohr and Heisenberg developed, the Copenhagen interpretation, that says that, when you're listening to a Geiger counter and you're looking at some uranium and it clicks, there was no way in advance to predict which uranium atom would decay at that moment. But one did, and you heard it, and that's fine. We can tell you the probability of it decaying over time, right, the half-life, but we can't ascribe to you why it decayed. So as Bohr said in a profound series of lectures around the Copenhagen, the Solvay conferences, from his point of view, quantum mechanics showed the end of the assumption that you could give a complete causal explanation of nature. Mm-hmm. That was a philosophical assumption which made complete sense in classical physics, but we discovered that it doesn't actually hold at some levels of nature. Right now, Einstein didn't agree with that, right? So he had his challenge to quantum mechanics and so on. But that's the one I follow. And I always say in my writings, supposing Bohr and Heisenberg were correct, what would that tell you theologically? So how do you bring quantum mechanics in? You interpret it philosophically. You state right up front, like a frame for a picture, this is this interpretation, and it could be wrong. And there could be somebody right now getting their PhD in philosophy of science at UC Berkeley who's going to disprove it once and for all, and that could happen. Mm-hmm. But you can't avoid the issue. That's what you have when you're dealing with science today. You've got one which is multiply interpretable. And so you have to jump in and take a stand and see what it says. So what it says from that point of view, again, within this picture, is that God is acting in with and through nature, to use the Lutheran term. And an atom is in a state of possible decay. It's a potential future for it. It could decay or not, and it could decay at various times or not. And that process is triggered by the actual physics of the surrounding atoms, its environment, and God's action within that process, which brings about one of two or both parts of the process. One, the timing of the decay, why it decayed now, not before, and into which state it decays into. Mm-hmm. What kind of radioactivity does it go through, or to use the two slit experiment, which slits does the photon go through and land on the screen. So there's two different sides of that decay process, or the collapse of the function. And God can be thought of as active in either or both. And we've all talked about the differences. Kirk Vector McNally has a wonderful argument about that. And again, it's really thanks to this long 20-year process where we got together and discussed these things over a series of 5 conferences.
So what then is, when you think of the miraculous narratives in Scripture, which ones of them do you metaphysically see as more or less problematic, or more and less viable from your perspective?
Well, let me just say before I go to that, I don't try to use Nauta for biblical miracles. Remember, It's not a miracle. It's not a category of miracle. It's a third category of divine action between liberal non-action, right, and full-blown miracle, which I take to be the Thomistic or Academic view, not Hume's view, but I usually use it because that's what everybody talks about. Mm-hmm. So when you go to biblical miracles, you've left that Nauta behind. It's simply not adequate. You've got a 5-dimensional problem with a 1-dimensional object. It's not adequate for the problem. So how do I look at them? Well, I mean, I follow people like Moltmann and Vandenberg and LaCunha and Johnson and the rest, and say, well, these in one way or another are proleptic manifestations of the new creation in this creation. Mm-hmm. Right? So Jesus calming the storm is showing the power of God to create nature the way nature should be, right? Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead is showing what human life should really be about and will be about. Now, you've got one more category, which I call more than a miracle, which is the resurrection, because it's even more than that.
Right.
It's the first instance of the new creation in history. So I'm using Vandenberg's notion of first instantiation, Jesus, God, and man. So you've got you've got many kinds of regular miracles, natural miracles, healing miracles, psychological miracles of recovering from sin. And then you have this even more miraculous event of the bodily resurrection, empty tomb. And so now it really doesn't shed a lot of light on those. I mean, it helps down in the details, and I've written on that. But now it's not a category of miracle. It's a category of between nothing happened. It's an ordinary event and an objectively real event, which has a counterfactual content without it being in any way a challenge to nature in its own processes.
Mm-hmm. So then, maybe you can lay out then the difficulty in starting to wrestle with the resurrection and the resurrection, not just as a debate about a resuscitated corpse, but the inbreaking of new creation, like the omega of our cosmological story.
Nice. Yes, it's certainly not a resuscitation. That's what happened to Lazarus. Lazarus was brought back to life, which is a miracle. I mean, grief. But the guy died. He was a normal person like you and me. Whereas resurrection of Christ happened after his death. Jesus really died on the cross. Full stop. He didn't swoon. And he was buried. And they knew where he was buried. And then this miracle happens. So to me, one needs the frame that Paul assumed in, say, 1 Corinthians 15, which is we can identify what happened to Jesus as resurrection because we already presuppose the general resurrection. We assume that in the future there will be a resurrection of all the dead, and he's drawing on the late apocalyptic literature for it, of course. And guess what? It's begun already. The astonishment was that we have the first instance of this. So Paul took off the shelf this assumption that Pharisees shared of a general resurrection, and then identified through that lens, this is what happened to Jesus. Right? That's not what happened to Lazarus. Well, I mean, in a way it is, but not really. But it did happen to Jesus. Therefore, he's a first fruit. Now, that's where I find one of the biggest challenges to the theology and science conversation. And you can't just be in the conversation, especially professionally like I am, with a title that carries it. And then when you get to a challenge like this, just give up. I feel committed, kind of ethically as a Christian theologian, to continue the struggle. But here's the catch. We have pretty good reason to believe scientifically that there won't be a general resurrection. And that's what the Big Bang threat or challenge is. That if the universe continues to expand and all planets and stars, everything else is gone, and all you have is a plasma of elementary particles. Mm-hmm. That's not what Paul's talking about. I mean, Paul didn't have that kind of problem. He had a lot of problems, but he didn't have the problem that, there was knockdown, drag out argument saying there is no general resurrection. Paul, is totally a fantasy. It's a myth.
Yeah.
He really believed in it, and it was intelligible for him. So what I'm saying is, how do we do that? How do we pick up the ball and say, yes, in the 21st century, we can say Jesus, the guy who did the miracles on the water, actually was resurrected as the first instance of the new creation. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the hardest work is. At least I find the hardest work. And we've had some hints about it, but I think the best hint comes from, maybe 36 scholars participated in the Resurrection Summit, in publication by Jerry O'Collins about 5-10 years ago. And almost all of them agreed on the notion that the best concept for bodily resurrection is transformation. That is, it isn't like he was replaced and he had continuity of identity. That's a kind of trivialization. It's that there are elements of continuity between the historical Jesus who died and the resurrected Christ. So it's the same person. And it's the same body but transformed. And he's still able to have a meal with his disciples. Yet he can appear and disappear. And within the Pentecost period, he actually he's risen and ascends. And so then you try to use that carefully to work out, well, if there will be, in fact, a transformation of the universe, that the future of the universe actually isn't what Big Bang says, but it actually is a different, far future. What is it about the universe now that is true and continuous forever? And then you can pick up the conversation with science again and say, well, science can't tell me much about how the universe could be transformed, but it can certainly tell me what elements of continuity there are and what elements of discontinuity. So in a sense, theology is like having color vision, and science is like having just black and white vision. We can look at nature through theology. We can see things about nature which is consistent with science, like a rose has a certain shape, but goes beyond science, the beauty of the rose, or the way its attraction to me as a symbol of God. And so somehow the project is, and this is what I'm sort of engaged in now on an ongoing basis, and I've been working on for 10 years now, is how to tease out that framework to actually give me some intelligibility around the notion of a transformation of the universe. But the first step, and I probably want to repeat this once more, is to say I can set aside the prediction of Big Bang, not because it's mathematically incorrect, of course it's correct, but because it needn't hold. Again, it's a challenge to Hume. We have to take our sciences seriously, but there's one thing when they describe what happened in the past, and it's consistent across the board. When they make predictive predictions of the future, then it raises a prior assumption. Is the causality which science discovers, say in Einstein's theory, is the causality a necessary fact? Is it a Platonic view of causality which dominates nature, so nature obeys conservation of energy? Or is the causality that science discovers and portrays through its equations a causality that's inherent in nature? Or basically, do the equations of physics prescribe or describe? So once again, Hume said they prescribe. If we got them right, and if they prescribe, then there has to be an expanding universe forever. But I'm saying, well, first of all, the physics may be different, but much more importantly, the physics is only descriptive. And so if God has chosen to act in a new way, and God gives nature new causal properties, as God did on Easter, then the universe is open to a general resurrection of some kind. I happen to think it's universal. I think this takes us to another question about ET and their need for salvation and cosmic Christ. But after we go through that whole story, I think we have a much more attractive view of the universe as potentially being transformed, Easter events throughout the universe in a process of being transformed into a genuinely new universe, not just new planet Earth.
So, okay, before I want to talk about the aliens, but before that, one thing I think would be helpful is to talk about the ontological priority of the future and how that shapes what you were just saying between kind of descriptive and prescriptive function of science. Because for people like Ponnenberg, yourself, Ted talks about this in some of his work, Jürgen Moltmann and things. The resurrection as the event of new creation and it being the first fruits and such, those are kind of, in Paul's way, a way of saying that, well, what happened is, the foretaste of the world's future or the cosmos future, and it's in God, transformed, resurrected and such. And that changes the way we talk about the process moving, right? Like that if you've seen the world's future revealed in the person of Jesus, then the future isn't, this determined arrow going out of our cosmos, or one that always is running on the same operating system and the horizon of possibilities available to it internally, that God brings something to creation that's not of its own as a gift.
Right.
And how can you kind of describe how you imagine that and see that? Because it's amazing how important thinking eschatologically is for wrestling with a lot of these questions.
Absolutely. Well, you said it wonderfully. In Moltmann, Pannenberg, Peters, even in process thought, in the notion of a subjective divine lure, there's a sense that the present isn't solely determined by the past, even if the past is indeterministic. The present isn't just a product somehow of the past, but there are actually causal factors working from the future. Now, people tend to distinguish two kinds. One is the immediate future. And so God immediately presents to the immediate future, say, at the end of this conversation, what we're talking about now. That is, lures us towards that future in an imminent way. And that's, in New Testament language, the imminent kingdom. Right? Jesus declaring the kingdom of God is here and now. So it's come to us from the future, but it's here and now. The second way is the eschatological future, the future of the future, or the Adventist versus futurum. The idea that God will transform the way the world is now, so creation, into the new creation, and that new creation then impacts the world as it is now, sort of like a black hole. So there's a little wormhole between the two. And so the present is impacted on by the eschatological future as well as the imminent future. And I think all of us need to do more work on the distinction. I did a lot of it in a Festure for TED, but it's all part of the notion that you're even more freed from an enlightened view if you recognize that whether you're in a world of Newtonian physics or quantum mechanics, the physics alone doesn't determine the immediate future. Okay? There's other causal action happening. Now, obviously, it goes against our intuition, because our intuition is, I'm sitting in this chair because I walked into the room and sat down. And so it's past causes during the present. But as long as you don't ontologize it and make it a metaphysical assumption, you can take it seriously. I mean, we're all take seriously. I need to work my weight because I ate too much yesterday. I mean, it's just the way how we live. Versus saying, I really am a creature of the future and the past. I really anticipate the future. And that anticipation isn't just a subjective hope or longing, although it is that, of course, but it's actually God luring me from the future. It's actually the God of the future acting in my experience as a human being. And so that's a kind of tiny image of what can be developed into an understanding of the resurrection as both an immediate future in the lives of the disciples. So on the road to Emmaus, they talk, and then suddenly he's revealed. And that revelation makes sense of everything that's happened just then. So that's a kind of immediate act. And what the resurrection is per se, which is the risen Lord in the future where he reigns, appearing, or Hannah would say, appearing, or Tillich would say manifesting that future in the present. But what's great about Moltmann, Peters, Pannenberg, Lacuna, Johnson, so many people, is they've taken what in Tillich was still a kind of vertical notion of eternity. So eternity is above us, or and place it into history. They've made it historical. So we can talk about God's eternity, not sort of parallel with time or timeless, but fully temporal in the future.
Right.
And then coming back into the present. So it's this historicization of eternity that's so profound. We get, I think, mainly from Pannenberg, but the other ones have all contributed to it. So all of that is a general framing. It's like you and I are putting up the tent. It isn't the whole show we're going to have inside the tent. But after a century of not having a tent at all, this is, Barth's God, tangentially hitting the present going on, or Tillich's little parabola where God comes down and goes back up again. This is a fully historical view that the historical future will be different fundamentally because God will act in a new way. It doesn't violate a law of physics because physics describes the natural tendencies that are both a product of nature and God's action.
In one of the things that in Pannenberg's early work that always struck me was the way the Christological framing of the question that if the proclaimer of Abba's kingdom dies cross dead, then Abba is not the good God Jesus said he was. And he was a failed Messiah. So stop calling him the Christ, right? Like and it's not just because of his cross alone, but when you look at history, Bonenberg says, like, you can't be a member of the 20th century and still think that on the surface of things, the narrative, the appropriate narrative of meaning is a God of love and truth created this, that there's something demanded of God to be yet to be revealed if God is who Jesus said God was. And so the resurrection is really, the faith in the resurrection is faith that the one who knows us completely and loves us completely is the good God, Jesus called Abba. And that the ultimate end of history beyond the conquering of sin, law, and death is that all things become subject to the Son to the Father, so that God is all in all. That beautiful picture in 1 Corinthians 15 is that
yes.
the point of the incarnation, death, resurrection is the revelation of God's loving face and the invitation to participate in the divine life.
Right.
And God has refused to leave us behind.
Right. Nice.
And so, because see, sometimes when we have those conversations, I think people get uncomfortable. I don't know really if I know the science, or I don't know if I know this. Underneath it, we're making the same claim theologically today that Paul was.
Yes.
That the appropriate book to pull off the shelf to understand suffering, injustice, and history and divine action is one of Jewish apocalyptic hope.
Right.
Where God's solution for the world is God's to give. And it comes out of freedom and love.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the interpretive framework. So it's just such an important, like when Bart says Christianity is all eschatology, he doesn't end up doing it, of course, but it's an important thing. What's up for grabs is not my grandmother's and your resurrection. It's whether or not God is the one. God revealed God's self to be in Christ.
You're right. You said it really well, Tripp. And my tiny contribution to the conversation is to say, well, and that whole beautiful picture you portrayed need not be seen as in conflict with science. And how do I do that? It took a long time to figure out that the obvious move, Nancy Murphy helped a lot, was to say, don't follow Hume and argue that first, the science we have now is apodictic, and therefore there's a conflict with that future. But to say, well, it's the best we know now. But if God chooses to act in a new way, then the causality that comes to nature then will be the basis for a new science. So it's not a conflict between science and Christian faith. It's a conflict between a particular philosophical interpretation of the laws of nature and Christian faith. And I think that personally was an immensely freeing insight. I remember sitting with Charlotte in Rome at night in St. Peter's Square, and the moon was full. And I told her, I was talking to her about that. And she said, if you never do anything else, you've done enough. That's huge, because it moves the presumed conflict, which I've struggled with since my dad died. And my minister said, we don't believe in heaven anymore. I mean, come on. Yeah. Finally, at age 65 or something, I finally am able to set aside this albatross and say, well, there is a huge problem. I don't know how to, spell it out. But at least I know I'm not challenging myself as a scientist and myself as a Christian. It's a challenge to that philosophical voice that snuck in through the Enlightenment, and it will be, like you said, it's like secondhand smoke. You're just part of that community that's saying, well, wait a second, Bob. Kind of embarrassingly, are you actually saying that the future of the Big Bang isn't what science says? And I'm saying yes. Well, doesn't that make you aren't you challenging science? And finally, I can say no. I'm challenging a philosophical assumption about how you take and interpret the laws that science gives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is, and there's a certain oddity in that that we use like the laws of nature, and if you're, most theists would think of God as a lawgiver, to then say, God's subject to the law, right? Mm-hmm. Like for those philosophical systems that do it, they recognize that's an odd thing to do,
right?
And yet I think a lot of people that are unreflective or uneasy around the religion and science conversation they all make without question, like the antitheses at the end of Process and Reality. Yes. When Whitehead's talking about God in the world, like, I completely understand the reason process theologians will find that attractive, because it solves certain solutions under certain situations. Yeah. But those are not the normal conditions of the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament.
Right.
And getting there metaphysically, or we'll put it this way, it's a surprise to me how many Christians haven't thought about it but are already there.
Right. Nicely said. And that's why I don't presuppose a metaphysical system and use it to relate theology and science like Whiteheadians do. I'm much more Bardian in that sense.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that earlier. My next book that's coming out, one of the things I work on in it is how the principle of possibility in a broadly open and relational perspective, but how challenging process theologies, because they don't actually let their Christology thematize their metaphysics. And so it's the metaphysics already sets the extent to which you can do things. And then God, after God's self-investment in the world, in history, through the life of Israel, into the person of Jesus, and all the way through his perfect imaging of God and fidelity and things, God is still the same metaphysical reality the whole time. Even though at its heart, it's saying God receives the whole world each moment to moment into the divine life. Mm. And it was in Cronenberg's one of the basic questions of theology. He has a couple lines that set me off thinking about it, where he said, and he was dialoguing about the Logos Christology of John Cobb, where he says, you would think that the incarnate Word would impact in a distinctive way the character of the Word that's always incarnating. And to think, like, sometimes our metaphysical assumptions are tools to thinking creatively about different theological topics. Other times, they're ones that close us off from new insights.
Right. I think you're right. So again, that's why I don't use them the way John does.
Mm-hmm. So now I want to hear about the aliens. I mean, you can't hint about aliens and waves of resurrection across the cosmos, because I've always wanted to know, like, did Jesus witness to Chewbacca, or is there a Wookie Christ figure?
Wookie Christ figure.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the whole biblical narrative is embedded in human culture in all sorts of ways. It couldn't just be a message. Schweitzer was wrong. It isn't just a teaching. It's an actual historical community in history. The basic argument is pretty straightforward. And Ted and I just published a book on astrotheology, and we have a lot of voices on this and stuff, or we edited a book. It's to say, look, this fall without a fall narrative says, as life evolves under neo-Darwinian biology and all the details, you get increased sentience and capacity for suffering and moral capacity for forms of altruism and species-specific, to use Celie Dean Drummond's term, for the ethology of primates versus the ethology of canines. And so you have a whole variety of ways of being in the world, but they do involve these dimensions of moral character and suffering and so on. And then they come to a kind of apex in the various Homo sapien, the hominids, and then Homo sapiens, and that whole story. And by which time it makes real sense to talk about salvation in Christ in that term, obviously. So the question is, if that's in any way universal, that is, if life evolves on other planets, in the habitable zone that have capacity for neo-Darwinian processes, would you get creatures somewhat like us, somehow deeply ambiguous, morally, spiritually, vice and virtue or not? And not that it couldn't have a variety. I mean, English and Swahili are very different languages, but they're both languages. So I'm speaking at the level of language. What would their actual values be? It's hard to know exactly.
Right.
it'd be indigenous. My sense is that for a number of reasons, God will be compassionate to those creatures as much as God has been and is to us. Sagan had the contrary view. Sagan had the view that we're the only sort of sinful or fallen creature, and it's because of an evolutionary fluke in our reptilian and mammalian brains. I always thought that dehumanized us. If all the other life forms are angelic, which he thought they were, then we're not just human, we're really dehumanized. I mean, what a tragedy that there'd be a species on any planet that would, have genocide. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
So I always thought there was really a kind of repugnant view of human nature. By valorizing other species to the point of being, quote, sinless, you make us really a horrific situation. In any case, my point is that I think there'll be a Christ incarnate in the species capable of receiving Christ and of needing Christ on any planet that has it. Why not? In principle of plenitude and God's graciousness. So that then gives me a much wider cosmic framework for eschatology, because something like the resurrection will happen in those planets throughout the galaxy. And then you can at least begin, the tiniest kind of idea of a universal transformation of the cosmos we live in into the new creation. Because otherwise, if it only is relevant to Earth, how would you even think, without being kind of baby science fiction-y, about how an event on Earth could affect the universe? Would it be a gravitational wave that spreads out? Of course not. I mean, the universe is too big. I mean, there's no way of any kind of physical transmission of what happened on Earth, even if the new creation began here, as I believe it did on Easter in Jerusalem, that it would affect, Andromeda, let alone galaxies across the universe. So to me, at least, you almost have to have some universal scope for cosmic transformation into the new creation. And if you don't, you dehumanize and make horrifically horrific the human situation on Earth. So there's just two sort of motivations to think that way. It doesn't mean it's true, but at least it gives me motivations of intelligibility. And again, Paul simply didn't have that problem. So, and there's no way to go back and ask him, what would you do, Paul, if you knew this? But I mean, I try to actually think that way. I try to actually think, what would he say about what I know about the universe, and still proclaim the resurrection of his Lord Jesus? So that's my thought. Now, I have to admit, it sounds like science fiction, but John Barrow put it in a really nice way. The question E.T. raises for us is, what can we learn about being human that we cannot learn without the discovery of E.T.? And that, what I'm saying, is one answer to it. That is, you really have two different pictures of being human. You've got the Sagan picture, which I don't think he ever realized was implied by it, but it really dehumanizes us into this horrific mistake, this awful rupture in nature, because it happens no place else, to being a kind of at home in the universe, even in our dirty laundry. I mean, that's how things happen. It's the only way, even Paul Davies will say, neo-Darwin evolution is the only way for life to evolve without miracles. So therefore it happens elsewhere, and therefore you get this universal situation of what I call the fall of the ball. So there's a kind of coherence. This is not a picture, I can tell you, but it's a kind of coherence of intimations of a picture.
Mm-hmm. Well, so here's something that just popped in my head, and I don't know if I'll like it after I finish saying it, but when we think of, if we think of the presence of possibility at each moment after the resurrection as a proleptic presence, then and we think that that's always been the case, that the God who chose to create the world in freedom has always intended to give this kind of cosmic theosis a reality, then the emergence of life, or like as someone like Simon Conway Morris kind of talks about these habits and ruts of life, where the emergence of the eye and all that kind of stuff would be something that where the conditions emerge cosmically, life comes, because God desires the other created in freedom to gain deeper subjectivity, community, and such to respond. Then, like, if we just take that same perspective and look at the emergence of the Christ, then you think it's not this intervention incarnation is not an intervention. It's the fruit of God's self-investment in the history of Israel. Like the Didache talks about, Jesus is the fruit of the vine of David.
Right. Yes.
If the world's future is being given as gift each moment, then when the world responds with fidelity, or when Abraham and Sarah venture out, or when Mama Mary says yes to the invitation of divine dwelling, then the possibilities of the world's future become more, they're intensified in the next moment, because the world has said yes to its future in God. And so if you think of it that way, then you could imagine both a way of understanding the emergence of depth of subjectivity and virtue and character and compassion and justice as a way of wrestling with the inheritance that you get biologically, and stuff. Where then the revelatory event in a different species, or in a different with their own culture and biosphere and all that kind of stuff, is the place in which the finite responds with full fidelity to the one who calls at each moment, such that the fully faithful life of Jesus is, in fact, the enfleshed and image of the invisible God.
Beautiful.
And that's what the world's future is when we reciprocate the gift of the divine life each moment.
Well,
and you would go around wanting to know, what does that beauty look like on a completely different planet?
Exactly. I mean, one you said it wonderfully, Tripp. I'm really impressed. I wish you'd write it down. But one little piece. Yeah, there you go. You written it down. From scriptures, the word became flesh. It didn't say the word became human.
Right.
And Niels Gregerson does a lot with that in his deep incarnation. Mm-hmm. So I just then amplify that to say, well, the word became flesh with the meaning of flesh for the biochemistry of each planet, which is biochemistry. So it doesn't conflict with the word becoming human flesh, where you've got people. We have Martians or whatever. I mean, teasing me. You get the Christ event, and I think that's so much more beautiful, because it's so much more canonic. I mean, Jesus becomes God available to them in their own way of being creatures, not just in the human way. We send a message to them about it. Well, guess what happened? No, it has to be, it's indigenous Christianity versus, colonization. It's saying you are equally deserving of salvation. In fact, you can even go with Ronner, where he goes with Scotus, and says incarnation isn't just about a rescue mission. Even if we hadn't fallen, there'd be an incarnation, because it's the fulfillment of human nature. It isn't just our rescue from our brokenness. So in that sense, Sagan could be right. There could be a lot of planets in which life is really angelic, and you still have an incarnation, because that's the completion for Irenaeus. It's the full image in likeness, right? It's the completion in Christ. And so Christ is the icon of the true humanity. Mm-hmm. I'll give Sagan credit. If he universalizes angelic nature, that's one thing. But if he says, well, there could be a range of ways of being creatures, and some may not even need a kind of Christ. Well, not because they sinned, it's true. If they were angelic, they wouldn't need Christ for that reason. But even for Ronner, they still need Christ in the incarnation for them in their species. Mm-hmm. So, we're beginning to develop some sense of that in interaction with the challenge to general resurrection, and how do you make that coherent with an expanding universe? I think 10 more years we'll have a better picture. It's slow in coming, but it's coming.
Well, and one of the things, in just even thinking theologically about extraterrestrial life, and what would how would you imagine life and culture and religion emerging if the God we have encountered in Christ is the God of all creation? Right? So some people go like, why are you going to talk about aliens again, Tripp? Which does happen, because I like talking about aliens. But on the other side, I think is if your Christology is not a cosmic one that engages in the giant 13.8 billion year history of the cosmos, then that's really embarrassing, right? And especially when there's all these amazing tools. How it's inspiring to me to think of the way that in my own faithfulness as a disciple, saying yes to the presence and call of God in front of me, I'm saying yes with all of creation and all its faithfulness to God. And that in the end, creation itself gets to say yes and embrace the fullness of God. But if we're just imagining, there's this giant, vast cosmos, one in where God enjoyed dinosaurs for millions of years, that then the only story we have to tell about Jesus is just about humans on one planet. Right. That's not impressive at all. So like having a cosmic Christology also is saying cultivate a theological imagination where the God you worship and serve is one at least big enough for your one space-time. Who knows if there's a bunch of others?
Perfect. Nicely said. One more thing about the prolepsis. I've also used that notion of what I call normative and secondary prolepses. The normative prolepsis is Easter, but that establishes a kind of concept of Christ appearing within each of our lives proleptically, and particularly at a moment of death. And then you can expand that to animals and their suffering. So one piece of a theodicy, not the whole thing. I'm still working on a lot of stuff. One piece is to say that it isn't as though only we encounter the Lord at our death, but so do all sentient creatures. And it's a wonderful idea that there is an actual prolepsis of Christ in the lives of sentient animals. So they really aren't alone in that horrible suffering. Now, it's not a full theodicy, but it doesn't leave the rest of nature out of the picture, or they're somehow saved through us or whatever else. I mean, that's not very helpful. And then you can extend that to the cosmos again, like you and I were saying a minute ago. So I would want to say, at least think about the possibility of an Easter-like event on every planet where there's species capable of doing it. Not just a secondary prolepsis, right? But an actual event of salvation like that. And then it's tied to sin is complicated because of Scotus. Because again, he could have incarnation without necessarily the problem of the fall. So, okay.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. And there's that, I think, a Trinitarian understanding of what the cross says about our suffering and stuff is also important in the sense of in the Son, there's a solidarity with all suffering and all suffering sarks, all suffering flesh, not just humans and such, but also the other side of it is that, and I got this from a friend who told me about what to say to his daughter. His daughter, their first pet dies, and a 7-year-old daughter. Yes. The dog has to get put to sleep. And so they go after school, take the dog to, get a Whopper because why not? Last meal, and nice loving dog. And she goes in, the dog dies, and she's crying. And her question to her dad is this how the father felt when the son died?
Beautiful. How beautiful.
And so a Trinitarian account on the cross, God is not just a fellow sufferer who understands,
right?
But right. Which is a beautiful, important thing, but also God has identity with all of us who experience the loss of life and loved ones, right. Because you can't experience your own death; you experience others, and God knows death both as its victim and as the onlooker, and that is a beautiful thing. And too often Christians don't realize that there's that type of solidarity, the solidarity in deep grief.
Yes, right. The tradition has been afraid of paterpassianism, as some of the father suffers. But that's what's being raised by what you're saying. It is very profound. It isn't just that God raises Christ from the dead, but that God the Father suffers with the Son's death. And I mean, Ted and others spell it out, but that's, I think, an important development in Trinitarian thought of this century. And it really goes to what that sweet little girl said about her pet. We've had 2 children and gone through many of those experiences, but that was particularly moving that God suffer that. Mm-hmm. One more piece of this is getting off a little, but when my mom died, the biggest concern was separation. She knew what a bond we had. And she was concerned for how I would suffer her loss because of that separation. My concern was, could heaven be heaven for her if I weren't there?
Mm-hmm.
And if we have to use ordinary linear time and say, well, she died, I'm still alive, I can't be there yet, then it really sets a kind of theological problem. And so I went back to this notion of prolepsis and said, well, there's got to be some truth to the claim that as she enters into heaven, I'm there to greet her, even though I'm here to mourn her loss at the grave. So in that sense, prolepsis is a really interesting notion of a multiply connected view of time, which I've developed in this time eternity book.
Yeah.
So it allows you to say her experience of heaven is fully heaven because she's not separate from me.
Mm-hmm.
We're forced together, even though my experience is grief and mourning because I really have lost her.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, and I think the observation goes that way for God too, right? Like, part of the eschatological picture for proleptic theologians is that God doesn't know how to be God without us, right? Like God has refused to be God without us, all the way to the point of giving God's self fully to the world.
Yes,
and Walter Rauschenbusch has this sermon about if the resurrection happens and Jesus finds out hell's full, where Jesus goes up to God the Father and is like, Dad, what the hell, literally, right?
Yeah.
And it's like the Father finds out and they're like, oh, well, we got to go rally the troops and empty this thing out, right? Because the whole nature of the one who breaks the cycle of victim and violator and such is one where God's refused to be God without us, and that's God's agenda is an eternally loving one.
Yes,
and that's such I think it's that's the character of God that necessitates Paul using Jewish apocalyptic framework to understand the event of the resurrection.
Right.
And I think it's the one for theologians like yourself and a number of the ones we mentioned to go, then what does that look like today in light of our historical critical imagination, our cosmological picture? But underneath it, the creative, reflective, critical thinking is connected to that deep affirmation that that God is truly the one revealed in Christ.
Right. Perfect. Beautiful.
Oh, I love it. This is too much fun.
It's been great. Good. Thank you.
So my last question is like, what are your favorite? Let's do favorite 3 books to teach. Like when you're in the classroom with your seminarians and you're looking at a syllabus at the beginning of the semester, what are a couple books that when you know you're getting to read them for the first time with a group of intellectuals at GTU, you get excited?
Great question. Well, to teach basic theology, it's going to be Hodgson and King anthology called Christian Theology Introduction, because it goes through each doctrine and it says that, what really divides Christian isn't the Reformation, it's Enlightenment. Enlightenment is modern science and modern philosophy. Then, unfortunately, of course, it has no conversation about modern science. So that allows me to bring that in and say, okay, we'll pick up the second half of the conversation they began. I think right now Ted and I are teaching Panneberg, and it's tough going for students. Some of the doctoral students, some are seminary. But if you're going to master one Protestant theologian today, I think it's going to be Panneberg and Rahner for Catholics. If it's theology and science, it can be one of the Gifford lectures. The 3, 4, or 5 biggest ones: Barbour, Polkinghorne, Peacock, Sarah Coakley, a couple others. If it's going to be, primarily evolution, it's going to be Ted and Marty Hewlett's book, Evolution from Creation to New Creation. I use my cosmology from Alpha to make it quite a bit. I think there's tons of stuff. It's hard to think in the 2 seconds we have left. Chris Southgate has an amazing book on theodicy called The Groaning of Creation. And he raises a question, which I think is one of the most important ones to raise, and very few people have thought about it. And that is, the response to the question, how come God didn't just create heaven? Right? And why this earth? And he's got a single sentence. I can't repeat it very well, but basically says, if heaven is the required realm for the eternal rejoicing of free creatures in God's presence, heaven couldn't produce those creatures. To be capable of that, you need first this creation, you need this earth to have produced creatures capable of going into that relationship. So heaven becomes the litmus test of what is needed to be a creature capable of agape love forever with God. Mm-hmm. And then earth presents the required conditions to produce creatures like that. It's not a John Hicks soul-making argument. It's much more profound than that. But it is an argument that tries to give some sort of warrant for the grief-strewn present creation, not as warranted, but as being required for the eternal domain that we're going to have. That book, in that little insight, is really helpful in this whole question, because behind all we've been saying, we haven't had a chance to talk very much, is really the problem with theology.
Yeah.
It's life in the universe, and it's theology, and it's pluralism. That is world religions. And each of those is a whole branch of conversation. But at least that, I would use that with T2 class as a beginning for that conversation.
Awesome. Well, I don't know the exact order they're coming out, but Dr. Southgate and I recorded a conversation on his theodicy and how biological evolution reframes just how big the question is.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Great.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the time, the conversation, your wisdom. Benefited greatly from reading you now. You're digitally present. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And you're a fantastic interlocutor. You're so wise and experienced. And you're a great theologian and a great pastor. I can just tell. I mean, I really relished the experience of being with you in these hour and a half. It's been fantastic.
Awesome. Well, hopefully we'll get to hang out in person in the near future.